before you go buying one of these FS-I6 transmitters, you have got to watch this video. Look, don't go buying one yet. Watch my video. Wayne Stevenson here. What's up everybody, Wayne Stevenson here. And I got a very special video for you today. Today we are gonna go over one of the most popular beginner radio transmitters for FPVing out there. The FlySky FS-I6 series. Here's the scoop. These FS-I6 systems can be a little bit confusing to a beginner. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to tell you all about these, what to look out for, what receivers to buy. I'm going to show you how to bind your transmitter to your receiver. I'm going to show you how to wire up your receiver to your flight controller. I'm going to tell you what receivers not to buy. And I'm also going to tell you how to configure Betaflight to run with your receivers. Okay, let's get started. The number one point I cannot stress enough is you are not buying an S-Bus receiver. If you take anything out of this video right there, learn that. Do not put that on your S-Bus pad. It will not work on an S-Bus pad. Okay, let me break this down to you. If you haven't already purchased a transmitter yet, you're going to want to get the FS-I6 or one of its variants. The FS-I6X or the FS-I6S. I've got an S over here I'm going to show you. This one here is the FS-I6S. This one here is the regular FS-I6. The X variant's out there too. It's got a little bit more channel support than this one, but this one can be upgraded to a different firmware where it'll support more channels, which is what you're going to want to do. You will need an added data cable for that. Think about that. I'd recommend going with this or with the i6X, which is identical to this, just already has the firmware updated to it pretty much. So just stick with me, stick it out, watch this video. If it helps you, make sure you give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe to my channel because I got a lot of good beginner videos out there, and I'm a FlySky guy, so this isn't the first time you're gonna see any FlySky equipment on my channel. Second of all, hit that notification bell. It'll let you know anytime I put new content out, because I am putting out at least 2 videos every week. If you're shopping for a receiver, make 100% certain that it is an iBus compatible receiver. I'm going to recommend a bunch to you today, so pay attention because you're probably going to end up buying one that I recommend to you today if you haven't already gotten a receiver. Specifically, I'm going to tell you this right now. Any receiver that requires PWM, which is a single wire for every channel, you don't want that. So if it's not on my list of recommended ones, do not get that. Here we are, guys. We got some of the most common FlySky receivers available on the market right now. Got an IA6 right here, IA6B, and an IA10B, an X6B, and an FLI14 Plus. Pay close attention to this one right here because you do not want to purchase that one, and it is one of the most common ones, at least was one of the most common ones to be bundled with the FlySky FS-I6 transmitters. That one's a PWM transmitter and is pretty much meant for airplanes. Some of the older flight controllers were compatible specifically for this style of PWM receivers that were meant for aircraft, but these days what we want are either PPM or, more specifically, I would say an iBus serial receiver, like the IA6B, IA10B, X6B, and the FLI14 Plus. The reason behind that is because the serial protocol is a lot better than PPM, which still uses PWM. So the IA6 you don't want to use at all because that one uses PWM communication with the flight controller, and it's meant for older flight controllers or for using aircraft, so stay away from that one. If you get a good deal on a bundle, sure, get it. You can always use that for projects down the road, but for quadcopters, you're going to want to use one of these ones here. The IA6B right here is excellent. I use that on a lot of my quads. It's got excellent range. The only downside to it is there's no real way to connect this to your frame. You know, sticky tape, zip ties. I'm constantly having to replace the tape, constantly having to put new zip ties on there. So I don't like these or the IA10B. The difference between these two is they also have PWM pins. One's got 6 channels, one's got 10 channels. Of course, it doesn't really matter because we're going to be using the servo line on here to get iBus communication when we do go to use them. Likewise, the X6B also supports PWM, supports iBus and PPM as well, and it comes with you know, a wiring harness that you can use PWM. Again, we don't want to use that. Cool thing here though is that we have some extra silicone wires that we can use for getting rid of older style wires like these plastic insulated DuPont wires. These are garbage. When they get hot, they create a mess. At any rate, I'm getting off track here, I apologize. So great thing here is it comes with an excellent harness for whether, you know, whichever way you want to do it. You're gonna end up snipping these off and soldering them directly to your flight controller anyhow. Very rarely are you going to see flight controllers now with the DuPont pins. It's kind of a thing of the past. We've moved on from there. The X6B is an excellent flight controller. Problem I have with this is the mount holes. It's a 30mm stack, which means you can stack it. There's some excellent frames out there. Only problem is that the holes are not your standard M3, so you might have to drill them out depending on the size of your stack, or the mount holes that go through them. So keep that in mind. It's an excellent receiver. I love it. One thing I don't like is the style of antennas right here. I'm always replacing them. They're falling off and they're a real pain to push back on, and you could end up damaging them. They're not the most expensive receiver, so it's not that big of an issue. FLI 14 Plus, this is an excellent receiver, great for you know, whoops, great for 3 inches. It's really small. Another downside to this is that there's no real easy way to mount this thing. You can use double-sided tape, but you're covering up chips, things like that. It gets it dirty. You know, you can heat shrink it, which is what I end up doing, but then when you go for that, the bind buttons are a pain in the butt. Let's see if we can see right there. I'm going to zoom in. The bind button is like a little microscopic little pin. You need to get your fingernail on that to push that in. Same thing here. This is a little bit better with on the X6B. You got bigger buttons. So just to recap this, these ones are great. They're a little big for what we need. You can probably rip it apart, take out the extra pins that you don't need. It'll get rid of some of the weight, but again, they're a pain to mount inside your quadcopter. Same thing with the FLI 14 Plus. And the main thing between these little guys and the bigger guys is you get increased range. The range on these guys is phenomenal. The X6B is a little bit less, and more so with this. And that's also due with the, you know, the antenna length and the type. Two that I want to mention that I don't actually have spares laying around to show you. They're buried deep inside builds. Is the FlySky FS-I6S receiver. It's similar, a little bit bigger to this one. Comes already heat shrinked. Similar bind button that sucks. It's hard to get at. I use a few of those. They're great. The range is pretty decent. I fly them in my 3-inch quads. Another one is the URAV or URUAV believe it's a 14 plus type, and it's also stackable, and the stack fits great. I use that actually in one of my builds. The first time I went to use an X6B and realized that the holes were too small was in a build video I was doing, where I was building one of my latest 5-inch quadcopters. And in that one, when I went to use this, I seen that the holes weren't gonna fit with the stack that I had, so I grabbed that one. I had it laying around. I'd seen that on Banggood and bought that. I was really impressed actually with it. It supports FlySky and I think FrSky equipment. So you can use both depending on your receiver, or sorry, your transmitter. Anyhow, I'm going to put links to those, and I'm going to show pictures. There we go. There's one picture, and now there's second picture. All right, moving on. I'm going to quickly cover the binding now. Now, I mentioned on these ones, they've got the little bind buttons. I'm going to zoom in on that for you so you can have a better look. These ones here use what's called a bind plug. So essentially you're just bridging a couple pins to bind it. And this is the little doohickey. The little tool that comes with these FlySky receivers that require the bind plug. And it's just on the voltage line here. You just plug that in right there, and it puts it into the binding process when you power it up. Again, these ones have the bind buttons right on them, and they have to be pressed down when you're powering up, otherwise you're not going to enter into the binding mode. So every single one of these receivers, when using the serial connection, requires only 3 wires: positive voltage wire, ground wire, and the signal wire. And they communicate via serial communication, and that means that they need to be put on a UART port, or a serial communication port. Most modern flight controllers have what's called S-Bus pads, and what that is an inverted UART, but we're not going to use that one because you can't actually use inverted UARTs for iBus communication. It's a different protocol. So what you need to do is find UART pads, and they're usually designated by RX1, RX3, RX6. Those are your UARTs. Sometimes you'll see inverted ones, and they might have like an N in front of it, like this iFlight FS-I6 F4, and you can see here NR2. NR2 is what their inverted UART is for the S-Bus communication. So stay away from those ones. Sometimes the wiring diagrams confuse you, and they show a receiver wired to NR2 or to S-Bus pads. Those aren't for FlySky equipment. That's for competitive, that's for a different brand. So you don't want to use S-Bus, you don't want to use inverted UARTs, you want to use plain UARTs. So they're going to be designated something like an RX1, RX3, RX6. You want to make sure that you're not using any of those, because other devices do use the UARTs. Something like your smart audio will use a serial communication. So you want to make sure you're not on one that you're already using, and you can check into your ports tab on Betaflight to find that out. At any rate, so for this particular one, you'd be wiring it to, I'd wire it to RX6, because I know that RX3 is going to be used by my smart audio to change my channels on my video transmitter. So I hope that clears up that whole S-Bus, iBus confusion there. You always want to use a non-inverted UART. So if it's labeled S-Bus, it's inverted. If it starts with an N, it's inverted. And that should clear that up. All right, I'm going to show you how to bind these things. I mean, I've already showed you, but I'm going to show you on the transmitter how we're going to bind it. First off, I'm going to show you that we can actually bind these to multiple quads. And by doing that, all you have to do is go into your system menu here and go to model select, and from there you can change all your models. So for instance, I've got this set up for a Mobula, a Tyro 7.9, a ZMR 250 clone that I fly, HX 230 that I fly, and right now I've got a test one here because we're gonna bind this receiver, bind this transmitter to one of our receivers. In order to put this into bind mode, there's two ways we can go about it. The first one is this bind button right here. So what we want to do is we want to press that down while we're powering on. That puts it into a bind mode. There's a second way to do this. We're going to go into our factory settings by putting both sticks down to the left and then powering on, like that. So here we can do stick adjustments, test all the keys and everything out, change LCD brightness. You don't want to mess around with this here if you don't know what you're doing, but what you can do is you go to the bind right there and hit OK. That's going to put it into the binding mode. Now, one of the reasons you might need to be doing that is if you have any problems binding your receiver. Sometimes it can give you an error, and it won't even give you an error, it'll just stay on this screen like that forever. If that ever happens, try it. Once again, down to the left on both sticks, power on, go down to your binding. So if the other method of binding, you know, pressing your bind key, powering on, if that doesn't work for you, that's your next option. Give that a try. Anyhow, let's go find some power so that we can power up a receiver, and I'll show you how to bind it. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and power this up with this UBEC here I got. This is a universal battery elimination circuit. You can take a LiPo, power it up, and it will regulate the power coming out of the other end here. We've got power. You always want to make sure you got the voltage right and the ground. So I am going to be very careful. And there we go. Okay, we've got power here, and I want you to pay attention to this flashing LED right here. What that means, that it's flashing slow, is that it's bound to a transmitter already, but it's flashing slow because it's not actually connected to a transmitter. And I'm going to power up this, and we're not connected to a transmitter right now. So I am going to take this, I'm going to put it into bind mode. So on the bind pin here, I'm going to plug that in. I'm going to plug the voltage in. We'll be very careful that I don't short anything out. And as you can see now, we have a fast flashing LED. That means it's now in bind mode. So I'm gonna put my transmitter in bind mode, and if you were quick enough to catch that, it let us know that it was connected okay, or the binding was okay. And if you look at that light now, that light is a solid red. Now the lights for all the FlySky receivers are pretty much all going to do the same. If it's flashing slow, you don't have a connection. If you flash fast, it's trying to bind. And if you got a solid light, it means your transmitter is connected to your receiver successfully. One thing I want to point out to you is that with the IA-10B and the IA-6B, we're not actually going to use any of the PWM pins, except for maybe powering it if we want. What we are going to use is the servo pins. So I'm going to show you right now. All these pins down here, these are all PWM pins. We don't want to use them. We want to use these three right here. Those are the three we want to use, okay? So if we're looking at it straight on, we want to use these three pins right there. And I'm going to plug in right now and show you just like that. Okay, so you can see where it's plugged in. Those are the servo pins. those are going to be the iBus there. iBus pins. Now I'm going to show you where our power pin is. So, I mean, your voltage is always in the middle, so that's kind of a safety feature. And see how I plug in? We don't have an LED flashing. That means we're not properly grounded. We're not getting power, which means we've got the ground pin, or our ground wire, on our signal line. So we're not able to complete the circuit. It's not going to get power. So of those 3 pins, your servo pin, or sorry, your ground pin is going to be on the left, and your voltage on the right. All right, so one more time. We're powered up. We got a slow flash here. That means that it's properly bound to a transmitter. It's not connected to the transmitter. So we're gonna fire up here, and we're good to go. All right, now just to reiterate, because this is the most often overlooked aspect of this, your 3 pins from left are your ground, the middle is voltage, and your right is your signal pin. One thing I'd also like to point out is make sure you have aircraft or airplane selected. What happens is if you have certain helicopters selected, you're going to have some weird mixing going on in your channels. I'm going to show you right now. So right now it's set to airplane or glider. That's what you want. The whole system's designed on that. If you got a variable pitch or swash 90, what'll happen, or any other helicopter for that matter, is you have some weird mixing happening in your channels here. Just watch the throttle channel here and see what happens. So we're seeing action on a whole bunch of different channels, which we don't want. So if you see anything weird like that in your Betaflight when you're checking your receiver settings, go back, make sure your transmitter is set up properly. And that's just through system setup, type select, and again you want to set airplane or glider. Holding in your cancel button sets that. And now you can see everything is the way we want it. Another thing too, make sure your AF/HDS is set to 2A. And I believe iBus also requires PPM output to be enabled, so just make sure that's enabled. I think that's required for it to work, so make sure PPM output is set to on. And I think that should cover everything. Should be good to go. Just to recap, I'm going to do a quick recap here. 1, make sure if you're using one of the IA6Bs or IA10Bs, make sure you're using the servo pins right there. And make sure you're using iBus, and make sure you're on a UART and not an SBus channel. Alright guys, I'm going to just give you a little rundown what I've got going on here. This right here is an STM32F4 development board. I've put Betaflight on this one, and I build flight controllers with this. I also use them kind of as a test bed for testing components, making sure they're working. I've got a FLI 14 Plus receiver right now plugged into this so that I can show you guys how to set up your Betaflight to use a FlySky iBus receiver. First off, I'm just going to have to bind this, so press the bind button here. As I said, it's a little finicky. You got to kind of feel for it, and I feel that it is pressed in, and it is. Okay, so it's fast blinking. That means it's looking for bind, so I can hold the bind button in. Oh, no. There we go. And now it is bound. So, power it, power back up. Okay, so we've got a solid light. That means it's connected to the transmitter and it is bound. We are going to connect to Betaflight now. So I've got this plugged into a UART port here on this SMT32F4. So we're going to go into our ports, and this one's the UART 1. If you look at the data sheet for the STM32F4 microcontroller, and UART 1 here is going to be serial receiver. So we've got to enable the serial RX right here. That tells Betaflight that it is going to use that UART pin right here, which is right here on the flight controller. I'm going to save and reboot that. COM5 will connect. As you can see here, serial RX. That's exactly what we're looking for. Now if we go under the configuration tab, under the receiver mode, it's currently set to PWM. You got to select one. We don't want PPM, don't want PWM, we don't want MSP, we don't want SPI. We are going to use a serial based receiver. And for the protocol, of course, it's FlySky, so we are going to use the iBus protocol right there. I'm going to save and reboot this. Now, let's go over to our receiver. And as you can see, we've got all of our channels working. There we go. And I want to show you what will happen is if you don't actually have that signal pin connected. And this is important because a lot of people think that it's connected but it's just not working. Well, just because your receiver is bound doesn't mean that it'll actually show up in Betaflight. So we're just going to pull the signal wire here. You're going to see what happens if Betaflight doesn't get a receiver signal. Right there. See how that throttle drops to 885? Nothing. When we put that signal back in, alright. Drop the auxiliary off. Looks like I need some new batteries here. Once again, we're going to drop that signal. You see how the throttle drops to 885, below the 1000 threshold. It's not receiving any data on there. Put the signal back, goes to 1000. So that's kind of a little bit of a troubleshooting tip right there.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and more importantly, I hope it helped you out. If you enjoyed it, please give me a thumbs up, and if you found it helpful, please give me a subscribe and hit that notification bell. I'm coming out with new beginner content at least twice weekly, and you'll get notifications anytime I upload a new video. Thank you for watching. Take care.